This last presentation is on early detection invasive plants. So very exciting, and probably a lot of species that you may not know a lot about. For anyone coming in new to the early detection presentation, if you are wondering how to use Zoom, please look at the buttons at the bottom of your screen on the little toolbar down there. If you have technology questions or issues, please use the chat to send those to the panelists. And if you have any questions to presenters during their presentation, which this last presentation is Kelly Kearns, you can send those via the Q&A. We might answer them with text, or we might have Kelly answer them using her voice during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. The webinar is organized by the Central Wisconsin Invasives Partnership, or CWIP. We are a cooperative invasive species group serving 7 counties in central Wisconsin, and we focus on different invasive species projects, particularly education, mapping, and control. We're not the only cooperative invasive species group in the area. Wisconsin has a bunch of these groups, and you can see that on the map on the slide. These groups focus on a variety of different projects, but they're always there as resources to landowners and to other interested people. So I highly recommend getting involved in your local cooperative invasive species group if you're interested in invasive plant control. And if you check out the IPAW website, the Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin website, they have more information on how to get in touch with your local SISMA. And if you can read the names on this map, that's also good. We have one other educational opportunity to share. From November 2nd to the 6th is the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference, or UMISC. This event will share all kinds of information about different invasive species topics, from aquatics to terrestrials, and education-based, and mapping and control. Lots and lots of information. And because it's being held online this year, the registration is less expensive than it would be during a normal year when it's being held in person. And it's a little more accessible when it's online. If you're just interested in woody invasive species, you can sign up for one aspect of the conference, which is the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Summit. That's just Thursday and Friday, not the whole week. And you can sign up for that summit for free. You don't get all the presentations from UMISC. You don't get the other like aquatics or non-woody invasives content, but you can get a bunch of really valuable information on woody invasives if you sign up for that free summit. For more information about signing up for UMISC, visit umisc.net, umisc.net. And for more information on the Woody Invasive Summit, you can go to woodyinvasives.org. Okay, so we'll get into our last presentation. This presentation is being presented by Kelly Kearns, the Invasive Plant Coordinator for the Wisconsin DNR, and she's going to talk about early detection, identification of invasive species.
Thank you, Asa. And so we are now going to be talking about some very early detection species, ones that hopefully you don't know anything about or you haven't seen. These are ones that if you have seen, we definitely want you to let us know. And so I'm going to cover a few of the things that I covered before, but just more briefly. I'm assuming that most of you have already been on the line and heard the last couple talks. And so just to briefly say that these species are ones that are all listed as prohibited in the state, meaning that if they're found, we want them controlled. And so we will be working with anybody who finds these on their property to try to make sure that they do get controlled. And so briefly again, going over restricted are the species that are widespread already or established in the state. And so they're not required to be controlled, although we certainly would recommend it. And then prohibited species are those that are not yet widespread or not yet established. And most of our prohibited species have not yet appeared in the state. We'll talk about our first one. We'll talk about we haven't known about until this year. And so it's one that is brand new in Wisconsin. So these are ones that we really want to be able to try to eradicate if at all possible. So for those, you're not allowed to possess them, and so we may require control if they show up on your property. So again, the distribution maps, the red slashed areas are restricted, and The yellowed areas are prohibited. Most of these species are going to be prohibited statewide. And then the dark blue is verified occurrences, and the light blue is unverified reports. Okay, so first one we're going to talk about is Japanese stiltgrass. This is our newest invasive plant in the state. We've known for a long time that it was coming. It first got reported in West Virginia probably 15 years ago. They think that it came in as a packing grass with some ceramics that came in from Japan. And people in West Virginia started seeing it really spread quickly. And so if you look at that map on the right, you see that it's already throughout most of the southeast part of the state, of the country. And we've known for a while that it was going to get here eventually, and that it probably would survive and be able to reestablish here. And so we know that this plant can be very problematic. This is an annual plant, so if it comes in on somebody's boots and a seed drops on their property one fall, then the next year this thing is going to start growing and produce seed by the end of the season. And then within only a few years, you have an established population. These photos that I'm showing are from other states, fortunately. The one population that we found, we were very lucky in that we found it very quickly, and it has not yet spread widely yet. The map on the left, the Adams County site, we believe is an inaccurate report. The actual real location that we found is in La Crosse County, and that's not marked yet because we just found this last month. So the La Crosse County site happens to be on state land, which is great because we can actually do the control work on it there easily. And it has not yet started flowering, which is also great. I was just down in southern Indiana, where this plant has spread all along the Ohio River, which is the river that forms the boundary between southern Indiana and Ohio and Illinois, with the states south of that. And it's spread along the floodplain of the Ohio River, up into the tributaries, and then up into the uplands all around in that area. And so what it looks like in those forested areas is this carpet of grass along the ground, like on the upper photo on the upper right. Then, since this plant is an annual, when you get frost, once killing freeze comes in, the plant dies, and then you have this thick brown thatch that's highly flammable. If a fire were to get into an area like that, it would just take off and go through the woods very, very quickly. And so this plant can be quite dangerous for wildfire hazards. And so in addition to that, of course, it shades out all the other species in the area. And unfortunately, for a lot of grasses, they would be killed off by fire, but this one actually really does well. If there is a fire, then the next year it's perfect for that plant to establish even more. So this plant is one that we've been fearing for a long time. We kind of expected it would come in like at a state park or someplace like that. It's in a state forest, so probably came in by some hunter or hiker. And so it's definitely potential it could be elsewhere in the state as well. Now let's look at how to identify this. Grasses are hard to identify. Most people can't identify grasses well. This one is distinctive because it has these relatively small leaves that are in the kind of 2 to 3 inch range. And it's got this silvery white stripe towards the middle of the leaf that is a little off center. And each of these leaves is spread out along the plant. You can see that doesn't have a lot of leaves at the base. They're kind of almost ladder-like spread out along the plant. And the plant also, it's called stiltgrass because it has these prop roots that help hold it up. This plant can either grow onto things and kind of sprawl onto things, or it can sprawl on the ground. When it sprawls on the ground, it can produce roots at the nodes where those stems are touching the ground. It can produce more roots, and so it can spread both vegetatively and by seed. It does produce its seed really late in the year. That you can see the seed head on the right. It looks kind of like crabgrass, but they're not always in threes like that. But it's super late in the year. When I was just down in Indiana earlier this week, it was not yet in flower. it's pretty late flowering season. It also in the fall produces this kind of reddish color. And so it's fairly distinctive and easy to identify in the fall. There are many plants that are lookalikes to this. When we were doing survey work for it up in the La Crosse area, then there were a couple of plants that were consistently in the same habitat as this plant, and you have to look really close to make sure it's not the stiltgrass. So this is a plant that if you find something that looks like this, we definitely want you to take good photos and get those to us. The next one is narrow leaf bittercress. This is one that we were informed about by our colleagues in Michigan, where they've had huge populations of this thing in the forest in the Lower Peninsula for a number of years. And this plant is a mustard, and it grows as either an annual or a biennial or a winter annual, meaning that the seeds that are produced in one year produce a basal rosette that overwinters as that basal rosette, and then the next year it sends up its flowering stalk and produces lots and lots of seed. Each plant can produce hundreds of seed. It generally spreads mostly in floodplains, although the population in Madison is in a park. We're not sure where it came from. It might have come from somebody's yard waste, and so there may be more somewhere else. We don't know. But it's a plant that can easily kind of cover the ground again, especially in that basal rosette phase. So looking at the plant a little bit closer, you can see what those rosettes look like on the ground. And so something that's called rosette means that it's coming up from the ground from one point of growth. The garlic mustard also has a basal rosette over the winter. And you can see also that those rosette leaves on the left are much more rounded than the ones on the mature plant. As the plant gets more mature, then those leaflets get much more elongated, very similar to garlic mustard again. And a lot of the mustards that are weedy around here, especially in agricultural areas, are yellow flowered. This one has a white flower. And this plant comes up very early in the year, like April. And so it's pretty easy to identify in part because of that really early flowering period, early growth period. Another one that's very early growing is a lesser celandine. It's also called fig buttercup. And it is one that has really taken off in Walworth County. Unfortunately, the Lake Geneva area north of Geneva Lake it is widespread and abundant there. It's also found fairly strong, heavily in a couple places in Waukesha and Milwaukee counties and a few populations in Dane. But where we find it, we see these complete, nothing else on the ground practically, except this carpet of this lesser celandine, which is only about 3 to 4 inches tall. And this is blooming. These photos are taken from early May. So it starts to grow it could be as early as March or early April, as soon as it starts to warm up a little bit. And it's flowering by late April, early May. By June, these plants have completely died back and there's bare soil there. So this is actually a non-native spring ephemeral, only found actually in the spring. And so it tends to move around by a lot by waterways, but it has a very unique life history because it spreads several different ways. It's as with a lot of other buttercups, it has these shiny, bright yellow leaves, petals, and then it has lots of the stamens in the center. And it has very glossy, dark green leaves that are each about the size of a quarter. It also blooms about the same time as marsh marigold. But marsh marigold almost always has its feet in the water and is as a basal rosette, whereas each individual plant is kind of a separate plant, and you will form like a carpet of the plant. This plant does produce seed, but the way that it primarily reproduces and spreads is by these vegetative bulbils. So this photo on the top shows that these little bulbils develop as early as this plant starts flowering. It's already got these bulbils developing. And when the plant then dies off, these bulbils are left on the ground. So you have this bare soil with just these little balls on the ground. And these little bulbils then can take root And also, and they can go floating downstream, they get washed down by rain, and rodents pick them up and cache them and spread them all over the woods. And so by that, you get in it spreading. And then it overwinters by having these small tubers underneath the ground. So even if the ground looks completely bare by July, it actually is full of these tubers under the ground. And of course, because this plant dominates everything in the spring, not much else gets to grow there. And so you have bare soil growing on these shorelines or hillsides between, say, the end of June all the way through March. And so it can really be a problem for erosion. This is one we're very concerned about spreading, and in some places it's way too abundant for us to really be able to get a good handle and control. Next one is a vine. This is black swallowwort. We know this has been in the state for quite a while. Once we sort of found out about it in Waukesha County, we looked in the herbarium records and found out it had been in Grant County in the far southwest for a number of years. And when it really gets going, it can again form this carpet, this understory carpet. The difference between this and some of those others is that this is a vine, and so each of these stems is in the 2 to 3 to 4 foot range. It can just keep climbing up. It can go up trees. It can crawl on the ground. And walking through vines like this is really tough. You're going to be tripping constantly. And of course, it is really hard to get other trees established in areas when you have a vine that's wrapping itself around them. When we first regulated this, we thought it was only in the far southwest and the far southeast part of the state. We knew about one population in Door County that was being controlled. And so we regulated it as prohibited most of the state, but now we found that it's actually found in several counties further north as well. Here's a kind of typical of how it grows up trees. And you can see that this can't be good for young trees to have something like this growing up it. It's in the milkweed family, so it produces these milkweed-like pods, but it doesn't have milky sap. So you can't tell that it's a milkweed by that. You really have to look at the flowers in those pods. The leaves are very shiny. They can be from heart-shaped down to much more elongate, but very dark, shiny green. And then again, they grow on the ground as well as up on the trees. And the flowers themselves are tiny. These are like 1/8 to 1/4 inch. They're beautiful, but they are tiny. And just like the other milkweeds, the pods open up and release their seeds that fly away on their little parachutes and disperse that way. This can spread into fairly dense forest. It can spread in grasslands. It can crawl over just about anything. Then the next vine is porcelain berry. And this is one that has been sold, is still being sold in a lot of states. And typically it's sold in this variegated form in the upper right of the photo there. But when these seeds then start a new population, the variegation disappears usually. And so what spreads in the woods is the darker green leaves. You don't see that variegation stay true to the young plants. And so people who have the variegated plant in their yard may have a hard time believing that the infestation in the park across the street is from their plants because they look different. But this plant is very distinctive when it's in fruit. You can see these beautiful pastel and deep green, white, pink, purple, blue fruits. And it's very different than its related grapes. This is very closely related to grapes, and it looks a lot like grapes, grows a lot like grapes. But as you can see in the center photo there, it can actually wrap itself around trees and girdle them, choke them out like the Oriental bittersweet does. And it can be a lot more aggressive than grapes as well. So to look at some of the differences, the colors of those fruits are really distinctively different. And they're also held in a more open cluster that is held upright, whereas grapes are always in tight clusters that are hanging down. The leaves are not good indication of the species or the genus, because grape leaves are highly variable. We have several different species of native grapes in Wisconsin. And the leaves themselves are quite variable on that and on the porcelain berry. So those leaves are really kind of tough to use. Bark is a good way to tell the difference. The bark on grapes of any age is shaggy. It starts to get very shaggy and shred. Whereas the bark on porcelain berry is a little bit more corky, and you can actually see the lenticels or the little pores on the younger ones. You can also get it confused with Virginia creeper if it's in the winter. And so it's good to kind of make sure you're looking at this throughout the year if you think you might have porcelain berry. One of the other ways to tell is by cutting open the pith. Supposedly porcelain berry has a white pith and grapes have a dark pith, but that's not always the case if you cut open the stem and look at what's in the center. So by far the best way to tell it is by those fruits. But just like a lot of these other things, they may not be producing fruits if they're in a lot of shade or not producing a lot of fruits. This is somebody in the Madison area planted this probably 20 years ago in the west side of Madison, and it now is investing hundreds of people's yards in west side of Madison. Can be very, very aggressive. Then our last one is our newest vine, and this one is so new to us that it hasn't been regulated yet. We found out about this a couple of years ago, where we know we have infestations in just a few counties. Most of them are pretty small and are being contained. However, the one in the far southwest in Grant County is all along a river. And so it's being spread probably along the river. It's also spreading probably by the farm equipment when they're tilling their fields, and it's probably picking up the tubers that this plant has and moving them around. And so it's also spreading all along their fence rows as well. You can see that this thing climbs all over everything. It'll climb up for several meters and forms these dense stands. It's got very distinctive flowers. It's got these big yellow tubular flowers. These flowers are about maybe an inch to an inch and a half across. And so they're quite distinctive when they're in flower. We have a lot of other vines that have those heart-shaped leaves. And so heart-shaped leaves alone is not a good distinctive characteristic. It's really those yellow flowers that are the easiest to tell it from. This plant will die back, the tops will die back in the winter, and so you end up with this dense tangle of stems that are, again, a fire hazard probably. And this plant overwinters by these tubers under the ground. And so you can see the small ones starting to grow up again in the spring. And so this is one that, as far as we know in Wisconsin so far, we only have male plants. And you can tell only by looking at the flowers to see if they're male or female. And if we did have female plants, then we would end up with these fruits that you can see on the lower left that look like small kiwis. And they're hairy like a kiwi, but much smaller and turn red when they're fully ripe. We haven't found those yet in Wisconsin or Minnesota, where they also have this. And so we're hoping that we don't have any of those female plants, because that would cause just a whole nother level of potential spread. So with that, that was the last of the new early detection species. But I do want to talk about reporting these. It's important that if you think that you found, especially some of these uncommon ones, that you report. And there's a couple ways you can do that. Obviously, the Glidden app that Anne told you about and EdMaps are a really great way to do that. You're getting all your information in one place very quickly, and we get the information in the format that you want to give it to us. It's wonderful if you can do that. Some of you are using iNaturalist, and that's great as well. There's a bit of a delay from the time that we get that information shows up. Usually somebody's kind of keeping track of something and they let us know that somebody has found something in iNaturalist. With the Glidden app, if you use that, then as soon as you report it and it's something that's problematic in Wisconsin, then Anne sees those and we can like jump on that right away. With the Japanese Stiltgrass report that we got this year, that's how it happened. A botanist happened to be in the forest, and she looked down, saw it, she took photos, she put it on to EdMaps. She noticed that we didn't have any reports for it for Wisconsin, and she reported it, and immediately Anne got the report, and almost immediately we had someone in Illinois verify that it was that species, and so we could go start working on that plant right away because she used that. Another way to do it that is available to you, because a lot of people don't like using an app or just won't do it for whatever reason, is just to send us an email. And so the best way to do that is to send the email to invasive.species@wisconsin.gov. And ideally, you should send a photo with it, good photos with it that'll help us identify, and information about where you found it. Like, don't just say, this is in my yard. Tell me where your yard is, and give us an idea of the abundance, when you found it, where you found it, and provide your contact information so we can get back to you. And ideally, you're going to want to show us a close-up of it, and then show us what your infestation looks like. So this is really important for certainly for anything that's prohibited, anything that's new to your area, or even if it's new to you, or if you have questions about it, then you can take photos and send them to us, and we'll find somebody who can identify it. If I get it and I can't identify it, I'll send it to someone else who will be able to, and we'll get you an answer eventually. And we can then also send you to some of those resources for control. So with that, if we can probably go back to Asa, and she can share that resources list again. Then if there's any additional questions, we can go to that. I see that there is one here that Megan put in, that she's been working on clearing all the invasive species from her acre of woods. And it was mostly blackthorn and garlic mustard. And most of the ground vegetation is invasive. So she wants to know what she should plant in its place. It's partially sunny and very sloped. Well, I think it first depends on where your location is. If you're in northern Wisconsin, that's going to be very different than if you're in the south. If you're in the sandy soils of central Wisconsin, then you're going to want to plant things native to that area. So I would look into finding out what is native in the kind of habitat that you're trying to restore in your area. And so try to get a mix of trees, native trees, native shrubs, and native understory plants in there. But before you put a lot of effort into planting, especially those expensive plugs of native plants, really make sure that most of your invasives are under control, because you're really going to be limiting your ability to do more control work if you put in a lot of expensive plants. One thing that some people do is plant in a cover crop, such as wild rye, even in a fairly open wooded area. You can get that in there for the first couple of years to get some vegetation in, especially on a slope. You're going to want to get something in there, and then you can keep working on your control before you plant in your native species. So she's in Waukesha County, so in that area, there's lots of resources in that area where you can find out what might be in your habitat. It's probably an oak forest or oak maple type forest area, and so looking at what would be native in that vicinity. So with that, Asa, do you want to talk about kind of where people can go from here?
Yeah. I also wanted to add in with Megan's questions about what kind of things to plant. She might try reaching out if there's a local Wild Ones chapter near her. That's a groups that focus on native plant gardening. So if you get involved in your local Wild Ones chapter, the people there might have a lot of good information for you. So to kind of wrap up this final presentation, thank you, Kelly, again for both of your presentations. Really great information. But just sharing some resources for people who want to learn more. I have this resources slide up. I recommend visiting the Wisconsin DNR for information about all these invasive plants and more. They have a lot of information about some basic identification, also the regulation things, which Kelly brought up a lot of, and prevention and control. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network, or MIPIN, has species-specific control information. You can type in the species that you're trying to control, and it'll like spit out specific information for that plant. The Wisconsin First Detector Network has fact sheets and videos. The videos mostly focus on identification, and the fact sheets have a lot of good information about what control strategies are best for that species and what herbicides work best, things like that. So I recommend that website. And then the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes, woodyinvasives.org website is really good for identification and control and native alternatives for a lot of these woody invasive plants, including woody vines. And finally, my website, the Central Wisconsin Invasives Partnership website, we will be creating identification fact sheets for every species discussed in the webinars today, and we'll be posting those within the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that, please check in with the CWIP website to see those fact sheets as we post them. Also, just final thank yous to our grant sponsors, the Wisconsin DNR Private Forest Grant Program and the U.S. Forest Service Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The funds from those grants helped us organize this workshop and advertise, and it'll help us create these identification fact sheets that people will be able to view on our website.